I was reading the comments on our last session, and one of you wrote a paragraph that was so incredibly precise, it essentially decoded the entire geopolitical and spiritual reality of the 21st century in gaming terminology. You wrote, "The Yukin of the victorious party posed such a threat to the overlords, it ignited a 1v80 of factions like never seen before on the Dunya hardcore survival world. Even generational enemy factions allied with one another against La ilaha illallah. You called the Quran a true Easter egg from the dev, and you said the ultimate victory is getting into the paradise server." I sat there staring at this comment because it is absolute, unadulterated genius. You have taken 1400-year-old eschatological prophecies and translated them flawlessly into the exact psychological language of the modern generation. You see, when you tell a modern person about theology, their eyes glaze over. But when you explain to them that they are currently trapped inside a rigged, hardcore survival simulation, and that the global elites have monopolized all the resources to keep the players subjugated, suddenly they understand perfectly. And what you pointed out about the 1v80 of factions is the absolute most terrifying and fascinating geopolitical anomaly on the planet right now. If you look at the board today, you see nations that have spent the last 100 years threatening to annihilate each other with nuclear weapons, suddenly shaking hands, sharing intelligence, and operating in perfect seamless coordination. Why? What could possibly unite absolute generational enemies? They unite when they are faced with the only force on earth that threatens their control over the simulation. They unite against the people of La ilaha illallah. To truly understand the physics of this 1v80 scenario, we have to look back at the original source code. This phenomenon is not new. In the time of Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there was an event known as Ghuzwat al-Azzab, the Battle of the Confederates, or the Battle of the Trench. If you look at the geopolitical landscape of the Arabian Peninsula, at that time, you had various pagan tribes, different political factions, and distinct religious groups who absolutely despised each other. They fought endless generational tribal wars over water, land, and ego. But the moment the Islamic State was established in Medina, the moment a group of people stood up and declared that absolute sovereignty belongs exclusively to Allah and not to the tribal elites, the matrix panicked. The factions that had spent decades killing each other suddenly formed a massive, unprecedented military coalition. They gathered an army of 10,000 heavily armed soldiers, an apocalyptic force for that era, and marched on Medina to wipe Islam off the face of the earth. It was the ultimate 1v80 scenario. The believers were starving, freezing, heavily outnumbered, and digging a trench with their bare hands to survive. The secular mathematics dictated that the Muslims were going to be completely obliterated. The hypocrites inside the city looked at the coalition and said, "Allah and His Messenger promised us nothing but delusion." They used secular math. But the true believers looked at that massive, terrifying, combined army of generational enemies, and they didn't panic. Their yuqayin actually increased. The Quran records their exact reaction. This is what Allah and His Messenger promised us, and Allah and His Messenger spoke the truth. They understood the fundamental rule of the simulation. When the entire world unites to destroy you, it is the ultimate proof that you are holding the absolute truth. Fast forward to the modern era, and you are watching Ghazwata al-Ahzab play out on a global macroscopic scale. Look at the top-ranked overlords of the dunya today. You have the secular, liberal, capitalist West. You have the communist, authoritarian East. You have the extreme Zionist accelerationists. Ideologically, these factions are supposed to be mortal enemies. The West claims to champion human rights and democracy, while the East champions state control. They fight proxy wars over microchips, oil pipelines, and digital supremacy. But I want you to pay very close attention to what happens the exact millisecond an authentic, uncompromising Islamic awakening threatens to establish itself anywhere on the globe. The geopolitical theater instantly stops. The generational enemies suddenly sit down at the same table. The intelligence agencies of hostile nations suddenly start sharing data. The United Nations, which supposedly exists to prevent human rights abuses, suddenly becomes entirely paralyzed and silent. Why? Because the capitalist and the communist both worship the exact same idol, the material Dunya. They are fighting over who gets to control the simulation, but they both absolutely agree that the simulation itself must be protected at all costs. And pure Tawheed is the only ideological virus that unplugs the human soul from their simulation entirely. A human being who actually believes in La ilaha illallah cannot be bought with corporate wealth. and they cannot be intimidated by state violence. Therefore, the overlords view the true believer as an existential threat to the entire architecture of global control. The 1v80 is not a political conflict. It is a spiritual quarantine. They are combining their forces to desperately contain the only group of people who possess the cheat codes to exit the matrix. The user who wrote that comment specifically highlighted the word yaqeen. They said the yaqeen of the victorious party posed such a threat to the overlords, it ignited a 1v80. Let's unpack the terrifying power of this word. Yaqeen does not just mean belief or faith. The modern world has watered down the concept of faith to mean a blind emotional hope in something you can't prove. That is not yaqeen. Yaqeen is absolute, unshakable mathematical certainty. It is knowing that the akhirah is real with the same undeniable physical certainty that you know the sun will rise tomorrow morning. When a group of people achieves this level of certainty, their psychology becomes completely impenetrable. The psychological warfare of the Dajjal system relies on leveraging your doubt. The media blasts you with terrifying images, economic crash predictions, and overwhelming military propaganda to inject doubt into your heart. They want you to think, maybe the overlords are too powerful. Maybe we should just submit and assimilate. But a heart filled with yaqeen acts like a mirror. The propaganda simply bounces off. When the overlords threaten a man of yaqeen with poverty, he smiles, because he knows his rizq was written before the universe was created. When they threaten him with death, he laughs because he knows that shahada is the ultimate speed run to the paradise server. The matrix has no psychological leverage over a mind that has already submitted entirely to the divine decree. This is what terrifies the architects of the global system. They can calculate troop movements, they can model economic sanctions, but they cannot build an algorithm to defeat a human being who genuinely wants to die for his creator. It breaks their code. We have to talk about the phrasing, Dunya hardcore survival world. I love this because it strips away all the romanticized, fake Disney Channel illusions we have about this life. The secular world tells you that the purpose of life is to be happy, to find yourself, to relax and enjoy the ride. They market the dunya to you as a luxury resort, but the creator of the simulation never described it as a resort. He described it as a testing ground. In the Quran, Allah explicitly tells us, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي كَبَدٍ. We have certainly created man into hardship and struggle. He tells us, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ. And we will surely test you with something of fear and hunger and a loss of wealth and lives and fruits. It is a hardcore survival server. Permadeath is enabled. You only get one playthrough. There are no respawns in the dunya. And the environment is incredibly hostile. The algorithms are trying to addict you. The financial system is trying to enslave you with el-ruba. The culture is trying to completely obliterate your el-fatera. If you log into a hardcore survival game thinking you are playing a casual farming simulator, you are going to be destroyed in the first 5 minutes. That is what is happening to the sleeping Muslim masses. They are walking into a spiritual war zone in flip-flops, expecting everyone to be nice to them. You have to wake up and acknowledge the exact rule set of the server you are currently logged into. It is supposed to be difficult. It is supposed to be exhausting. The moment you accept that the dunya is a prison for the believer and a paradise for the disbeliever, the anxiety of unmet expectations completely vanishes. You stop being surprised when the system attacks you and you start focusing entirely on surviving the level. When you realize you are in a hardcore survival simulation, your absolute first priority must be acquiring the source code. You cannot beat a rigged game if you do not understand how the developer programmed the physics of the world. The user called the Quran a true Easter egg from the dev. Think about the profound reality of that statement. The architects of the global matrix, the governments, the media, the educational institutions have spent centuries building massive, complex libraries of secular philosophy, political science, and economic theory. They want you to read their books so you play by their rules. But the creator of the entire universe bypassed all of their academic institutions and dropped the absolute unadulterated source code directly into the hands of an unlettered prophet in the middle of a barren desert. The Quran is not just a book of poetry or historical stories. It is the literal, verbatim speech of the architect of reality. It contains the exact psychological blueprints of your enemies. It maps out the precise, inevitable collapse of arrogant empires. It gives you the specific cheat codes required to bypass the traps of shaitan. When you recite the Quran with tadabbur, deep reflection, you are literally downloading the developer's notes. You begin to see the matrix in lines of code. The overlords want you disconnected from this book. They want it sitting on a high shelf, collecting dust, only taken down to be read mindlessly at funerals. Because they know that a human being who truly understands the source code becomes completely immune to their psychological operations. The global media ridicules the book because it is the only manual on earth that exposes their entire system as a fragile, temporary illusion. The overlords understand the threat of the source code, which is why they have initiated the 1v80 protocol. I want you to look at Islamic eschatology regarding the end times, specifically the prophecies concerning al-Malahim, the great battles. The Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam prophesied a time when the entire world would gather against the Ummah under 80 different flags, 80 factions, 80 banners, uniting under a single coalition to wipe out the believers. For centuries, scholars read that hadith and wondered how such a massive, globally coordinated alliance could possibly form. What could unite the entire planet? Today, we don't have to wonder. We are watching the geopolitical infrastructure for the 80 flags being laid down right in front of our eyes. Look at the United Nations. Look at global military coalitions. Look at how instantly the international community forms a monolithic, unified front the second a true Islamic movement refuses to bend the knee to the secular world order. They will disagree on trade tariffs. They will argue over borders, but they will vote in absolute unanimous agreement when it comes to suppressing the concept of jihad or the implementation of Sharia. You are watching the preamble to the Al-Malahim. The global system of a Dajjal is organizing its forces. They are creating a unipolar ideological matrix where any deviation from the secular, liberal, materialistic religion is treated as a global security threat. The 1v80 is not a metaphor. It is an impending mathematical military reality. And if you are still trying to appease these 80 flags, if you are still trying to prove to them that you are one of the good ones, you are going to be completely crushed when the final sorting happens. This is where we have to address the absolute psychological devastation of realizing that you are on the one side of the 1v80. The user commented, "You have soothed my heart and boosted my iman after much despair." I'm glad someone else sees past all the noise. The despair is real. When you unplug from the matrix, the initial realization is horrifying. You look at the massive military budgets of the overlords, you look at their control over global media, you look at their artificial intelligence grids, and you look at the fractured, bleeding, deeply compromised state of the Ummah, and your logical brain screams, "We cannot win this." You feel a profound, suffocating despair. The noise of the Dunya is designed to amplify that despair. Every time you open Twitter or turn on the news, the algorithm feeds you images of Muslim humiliation, destruction, and political impotence. The psychological objective is to break your will to resist. The overlords want you to believe that resistance is mathematically futile so that you will just give up, assimilate, and accept your role as a subservient NPC in their simulation. But this despair is an illusion engineered by shaitan. The antidote to this despair is returning to the source code. When you open the Quran, you realize that the 1v80 is not a new game mode. It is the exact same game mode that every single prophet had to play. Noah was completely outnumbered. Ibrahim was thrown into a literal fire by the entire political establishment. Musa was chased by the greatest army on earth to the edge of the sea. The odds are supposed to be impossible. If the odds were easy, it wouldn't be a test of al-yaqeen. You have to realize that the 80 and the 1v80 are fighting with a massive fatal handicap. They are fighting for the dunya. They are fighting to preserve a simulation that is actively mathematically decaying. Their power relies on physical supply chains, fiat currency printing, and the fragile psychological compliance of their populations. All of these things are entirely finite and deeply vulnerable. The one Al-Taifa al-Mansura is fighting for the akhara. They are fighting for the absolute reality that sits completely outside the bounds of the simulation. This creates a massive asymmetry in the game theory. A soldier fighting for his corporate paycheck, his pension, and his desire to go home and watch Netflix will never, ever be able to withstand the kinetic and psychological force of a man who is actively rushing towards Shahada. The overlords know this. This is why they fight from behind heavily fortified walls, using drones, algorithms, and proxy armies. They are terrified of direct physical confrontation with the believers because they know their own populations are infected with extreme wohan. The modern secular man has absolutely nothing worth dying for. He only has things he wants to consume. When the hardcore survival meta shifts from digital manipulation to actual physical endurance, the matrix collapses. The believers are conditioned for hardship, fasting, waking up in the cold, detaching from materialism through zuhud. This is spiritual and physical hardening. While the overlords are busy building comfortable, degenerate societies that create weak men, the believers are being forged in the furnace of absolute pressure. The 1v80 is not a slaughter, it is an anvil. And because the overlords cannot break the core of the victorious party, they attempt to create fake versions of it. The matrix loves controlled opposition. If they see that young men in the ummah are waking up feeling disenfranchised and wanting to rebel against the secular world order, the system will actively promote fake, highly monitored leaders for them to follow. They will create alpha male influencers who use some Islamic aesthetics, who talk about fighting the matrix, but whose actual core philosophy is purely materialistic. They will tell you to fight the matrix by getting a Bugatti, making millions of dollars, and acquiring status. Do you see the brilliant, terrifying deception in that? They are telling you to fight the system by becoming the absolute best consumer within the system. They redirect your righteous spiritual anger into the exact pursuit of it-takathur that Allah warned you about. They replace the sunnah with a toxic secular red pill ideology. You think you are escaping the matrix, but you are actually just upgrading to a premium cell inside the exact same prison. The true victorious party does not care about your sports cars or your podcast views. The true meta is not about flexing on the overlords with superior wealth. It is about completely rejecting the concept that wealth is the metric of success. The ultimate flex on the Dajjalic system is looking at their mountains of gold and genuinely in the depths of your calip feeling absolutely nothing. That is the true unplugging. When they realize they cannot buy you, they realize they cannot control you, we have to prepare our minds for the fact that the 1v80 dynamic is going to require us to endure extreme social and economic friction. When you refuse to assimilate, the matrix will initiate its quarantine protocols. The user said they are currently weak, ridiculed in global media. You must completely embrace this ridicule. The fear of being cringy, the fear of being cancelled, the fear of being labeled a fundamentalist by secular people is the invisible leash the system has around your neck. You have to take a knife and cut the leash. When you go to your corporate job or your university and the HR department mandates that you participate in the celebration of a degeneracy that Allah explicitly cursed, you have to be willing to sit down, look them in the eye and say no. And when they threaten your career, your degree, or your social standing, you have to lean into your aliqaim. You have to realize that the rizq they are threatening to take away was never theirs to give in the first place. You are operating on the source code. The dev wrote your provision before you were a fetus in the womb. The overlords are just middle management NPCs who think they control the bank. The moment you fold, the moment you compromise the Sharia to save your salary, you have officially logged out of the victorious party and surrendered to the 80 flags. It is binary. There is no middle ground in the hardcore survival world. You either stand on the truth and take the hits, or you kneel to the illusion and lose your soul. The psychological isolation of standing on the truth is what breaks most people. It is the schizo feeling the comment referred to. You feel like you are the only sane person in an asylum. You look at the news anchors perfectly delivering their teleprompter lies. You look at the politicians performing their pre-scripted debates. You look at the masses enthusiastically consuming the poison, and you feel entirely alone. This is exactly why the physical realization of the Jama'ah is absolutely non-negotiable. You cannot survive a 1v80 alone in your bedroom. You will mathematically go insane. You must actively seek out the other players who are reading from the source code. You must build physical, untraceable networks of brotherhood and sisterhood. You need people in your physical proximity who can look you in the eye and say, you are not crazy. The world is crazy. Hold the line. The ummah is not a digital concept. It is a physical body. If you are isolated, the wolves of the algorithms will pick you off. They will feed you customized despair until you completely log out of your faith. We have to rebuild the tribal loyalty of the early Muslims. We must protect each other. fund each other, and shield each other's minds from the psychological operations of the media. When the 80 flags finally converge, the only thing standing between you and absolute annihilation will be the mercy of Allah and the physical shields of the believers standing to your left and your right. But let us look at the ultimate final cheat code of this simulation. The user perfectly summarized the absolute end game. The ultimate victory is getting into the paradise server. Wake up. This is the ultimate paradigm shift. The secular overlords believe the game ends when the biological heart stops beating. Therefore, their entire strategy revolves around maximizing pleasure and avoiding death before the screen goes black forever. But the believer knows that the dunya is just the loading screen. It is the tutorial level, the actual game, the eternal reality, the infinite server where the physics of pain, fatigue, and sadness do not even exist is Jalanya. When you reprogram your brain to view the paradise server as the absolute definitive goal, the massive terrifying threats of the 80 factions suddenly look incredibly small. They threaten you with prison. Prison is just a secluded place to read the source code and engage with the dev. They threaten you with poverty. Poverty is just the removal of the distractions that keep you away from Qiyamul Layl. They threaten you with death. Death is the VIP ticket out of the hardcore survival world and directly into the presence of the Creator. When your psychology shifts to this level, you achieve absolute invincibility. You become a player who cannot be defeated because the enemy's ultimate win condition, killing you, is exactly your ultimate win condition. This is the staggering, brilliant, flawless design of the Islamic meta. It is mathematically unbreakable. The overlords are terrified because they are beginning to realize that the sleep is wearing off. The extreme, unprecedented brutality they are unleashing on the ummah right now is not a sign of their supreme confidence. It is a sign of their absolute frantic panic. A secure empire does not need to censor the internet. A confident superpower does not need to arrest students for protesting or threaten algorithmic bans on anyone who speaks the truth. They are doing this because they see the numbers. They see the youth of the ummah bypassing their secular educational programming, bypassing the fake sanitized scholars they put on television, and going straight back to the raw, unadulterated source code of the Quran and the Sunnah. They see the 1v80 dynamic forming, and they are terrified because they know the history of what happens when that dynamic reaches its boiling point. The matrix is glitching, the illusions are failing, the blue pill is losing its effect. Every single bomb they drop, every lie they broadcast on their networks is just serving to brutally wake up millions of Muslims who were previously content to just sleep in the dunya. They are radicalizing the ummah against the deception. They are digging their own eschatological graves. The law of convergence is absolute. The forces of Ad-Dajjal are assembling their 80 flags, but in doing so they are actively forging the very generation of believers that will ultimately dismantle their entire empire. This is the reality of the board in 2026. The lines are drawn. The generational enemies have allied against the truth. The 1v80 is no longer a historical concept. It is the daily headline. You are currently logged into the most intense, unforgiving, and critical era of the hardcore survival world. The only question that remains is how you are going to play the meta. Are you going to continue seeking validation from the top-ranked overlords who despise you? Are you going to keep watering down the source code to make it palatable to the NPCs who are actively trying to destroy you? Or are you going to embrace the profound honor of the schizo awakening? Are you going to pick up the hot coal, accept the ridicule of the global media, lock shields with Tataifa Mansura, and fight for the ultimate victory of the paradise server? The illusion is crumbling. The dev has given you the manual. The outcome has already been written. Wake up, unplug from their despair, reclaim your Ilyaqeen. The final levels of the simulation are here, and the victorious party is waiting for you to take your place. Let's talk about the exact mechanics of how you play this hardcore survival meta on a daily basis. The user said the ultimate victory is getting into the paradise server. How do you actually do that when the entire architecture of the 1v80 matrix is designed to force you into spiritual bankruptcy? It starts with recognizing that your daily routine is a literal battlefield. The system does not attack you with grand cinematic moments where you are forced to choose between Allah and the overlords. It attacks you in the micro decisions. It attacks you in the algorithms. It attacks you in the exhaustion of the corporate grind. You wake up and the simulation immediately attempts to assert dominance over your bandwidth. Before your feet hit the floor, your phone is buzzing with notifications, emails, and news alerts, specifically engineered to spike your cortisol and trap you in a state of chaotic reaction. If you engage with that feed before you engage with the source code, you have already lost the day. You have surrendered the high ground to the 80 factions. To win the meta, you must aggressively, violently reclaim your mornings. You must wake up before the matrix boots up. You must establish your connection to the dev through Qiyam al-Layl, when you stand in the dark, entirely alone, and recite the chord of your own psychology. You are overriding the secular programming that tells you the Dunya is the ultimate reality. You are putting on the spiritual armor required to walk into the simulation and not get digested by the algorithms. The next phase of the survival meta is information quarantine. The 80 factions control the global media apparatus, which means 99% of the information you consume is weaponized. They use the news to farm your outrage and your despair. They want you emotionally exhausted because an exhausted player makes critical mistakes. You have to understand that reading the news is not staying informed. It is willingly injecting psychological poison into your own veins. You have to severely restrict your intake of their propaganda. But this doesn't mean you stick your head in the sand. It means you change the lens through which you view reality. When you do observe the geopolitical board, you do not analyze it using their secular metrics. When they broadcast an economic crisis, you recognize it as the inevitable mathematical collapse of their system of Urban. When they broadcast a new war, you recognize the eschatological convergence of their apocalyptic scripts. You look at their chaos with absolute chilling calm, because the source code already told you this was going to happen. They are acting exactly as the Quran predicted they would act. Your job is not to panic alongside the NPCs. Your job is to observe the collapse, protect your Ilyakin, and focus entirely on the micro actions you can actually control. You cannot control the UN. You cannot control the central banks. But you can completely control whether or not you lower your gaze, whether your income is halal, and whether you treat your family with justice. That is your actual sphere of influence. We have to critically address the concept of ambition within this survival world. The overlords want you to be ambitious, but only within the very strict parameters of their corporate matrix. They want you ambitious for a corner office, a luxury car, and the verified social media account. They gamified the Dunya so that you spend your entire limited biological lifespan grinding for digital trophies that do not actually exist. The true meta completely hijacks this ambition and redirects it toward the absolute reality. The user said party just needs more bodies willing to go to Jannah for Allah's word to reign supreme. That is the ultimate ambition. You have to stop desiring the pathetic, temporary rusted medals of the secular world, and you must start desiring the absolute highest ranks of the paradise server. Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us not to ask for the basement of Jannah. He told us to ask for Firdaus al-Ala, the absolute highest, most elite level, directly beneath the throne of the most merciful. Why would you exhaust your soul trying to become a middle manager in a decaying, degenerate, hyperinflationary corporate dystopia when you could expend that exact same energy to secure an eternal, unimaginable kingdom? You have to elevate your standards. You have to look at the billionaires and the technocrats of the Dunya with absolute pity. They are playing in a sandbox, building castles out of dirt, completely blind to the fact that the tide is coming in to wash it all away. You are playing for eternity. To play for eternity, you have to fundamentally change your relationship with wealth and resources. The 1v80 coalition uses economic strangulation as their primary weapon of control. They use inflation to steal your time, and they use debt to buy your obedience. You cannot be a free player in this game if the overlords own your mortgage, your car loan, and your credit card debt. To break the meta, you must practice aggressive financial minimalism. You must completely eradicate the desire to flex on people who do not care about you. If you are buying luxury brands to project status in the matrix, you are a slave to the matrix. The victorious party practices true zuhud. They accumulate resources not to hoard them and not to show off, but to weaponize them in the path of Allah. They use their wealth to build independent parallel communities. They use it to fund the physical infrastructure of the ummah, so that when the 80 factions attempt to cut off the supply lines, the believers do not starve. You must learn hard physical skills. You must learn how to generate value outside of the corporate digital grid. because the technocrats are currently deploying AI to completely automate and eliminate the white-collar class. When they roll out universal basic income tied to a programmable central bank digital currency, they will have the power to instantly delete your ability to buy food if you refuse to comply with their ideology. You have to build the economic lifeboat right now, today, before the water breaches the hull of the ship. The survival meta also demands that we completely rebuild the concept of wala wal bara in the modern age. Loyalty and disavowal. The liberal, secular world order demands absolute inclusivity. They demand that you accept, validate, and celebrate every single degenerate ideology and lifestyle they invent. And if you refuse, they excommunicate you from their society. The sleeping Muslim tries to play this game. They try to be the cool, tolerant Muslim who agrees with everyone, hoping the 80 factions will finally accept them. It never works. It just leads to absolute spiritual humiliation. To join a Ta'if al-Mansura, you have to draw a hard, violent line in the sand. Your ultimate loyalty belongs exclusively to Allah, His Messenger, and the believers. And you must completely, unapologetically disavow the systems, the ideologies, and the factions that are actively at war with your Creator. You cannot straddle the fence. You cannot be an ally to the matrix while claiming to submit to the dev. When you draw this line, the social friction is going to be agonizing. You are going to lose friends, you might lose corporate opportunities. The algorithm will absolutely suppress you. You will experience the raw, biting reality of being among the al-ghuraba. But on the other side of that social friction is the absolute unshakable freedom of a soul that has finally stopped performing for ghosts. When you stop caring if the overlords like you, they completely lose their power over you. This is why the physical realization of the Jama'ah is the only way you survive the psychological pressure of the 1v80. You cannot play a hardcore survival game solo. The isolation will literally drive you insane. The user mentioned the schizo feeling of waking up, and the only cure for that feeling is looking into the eyes of a physical human being who sees the exact same reality you do. We have to violently reject the digital illusion of community. A Discord server is not a community. A Twitter following is not a tribe. When the 80 factions converge, your digital followers are not going to show up at your door to protect your family or feed your children. You must find the other strangers in your physical proximity. You must go to the masjid. You must look past the petty, microscopic theological arguments that currently divide us. And you must lock shields with anyone who is sincerely holding on to the absolute core of Tawheed. The early Muslims did not conquer the known world by arguing in comment sections. They conquered it because they loved each other for the sake of Allah more than they loved the dunya. We have to rebuild that exact physical brotherhood and sisterhood. We have to create localized, unbreakable networks of trust. When the system attempts to crush one of us, the collective body must absorb the impact. The matrix wants you isolated and paranoid. The ultimate rebellion is to build a physical unified tribe right under their noses. We have to prepare our minds for the fact that the 80 factions are going to escalate their psychological operations to unprecedented levels. As the matrix begins to structurally fail, as their economies collapse and their geopolitical influence wanes, they are going to become increasingly desperate and incredibly violent. They are going to use their media monopolies to broadcast endless streams of terror, propaganda, and inversion. They will attempt to convince you that the victorious party has been entirely wiped out. They will try to convince you that the source code has been corrupted and that resistance is mathematically impossible. They want to induce a state of total paralyzing despair. You must preemptively inoculate your mind against this specific psychological attack. You do this by returning to the core algorithm of the simulation. Allah explicitly warns us in the Quran, وَلَا تَهِنُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا وَأَنْتُمُ الْأَعْلَوْنَ إِن كُنْتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. So do not weaken and do not grieve, and you will be superior if you are true believers. Notice the condition. If you are true believers, superiority in this simulation is not tied to your military hardware or your GDP. It is tied entirely to the purity of your iman. If you maintain your connection to the dev, if you hold firmly to the source code, you are mathematically superior to the 80 factions, even if they have you completely surrounded. The despair they try to sell you is a localized illusion. Do not buy it. The overlords are terrified because they are beginning to realize that their ultimate weapon, the fear of physical death, is completely useless against the true players of this game. The user commented, said party just needs more bodies willing to go to Jannah for Allah's word to reign supreme on earth. This is the absolute cheat code that breaks the matrix. The secular technocrats view biological death as the ultimate terrifying end of consciousness. Therefore, they assume that if they threaten a population with death, that population will instantly submit. It works perfectly on the sleeping masses. But when they point their weapons at a member of the Taif al-Mansura, they encounter a terrifying psychological anomaly. They encounter a human being who views death not as an end, but as the exact moment they graduate from the hardcore survival server and enter the eternal reality of Jannah. How do you coerce a man who genuinely, deeply desires his shahadata? You can't. The moment you are no longer afraid of leaving the dunya, the 80 factions completely lose all leverage over your behavior. You become entirely ungovernable by the matrix. You become a free human being. The overlords can bomb the physical infrastructure, they can destroy the buildings, but they cannot kill the ideology, and they cannot break a mind that has already submitted to the divine decree. The blood of the believers does not extinguish the truth. It acts as the exact fuel that awakens the rest of the ummah. And that awakening is exactly what we are witnessing right now. The comment said, if all the Muslims woke up, the meta would change the dunya hardcore survival world forever. The overlords know this. They have run the simulations. They know that their entire system of global control is built on the fragile passive consent of the sleeping masses. The 1v80 coalition only works as long as the one remains fragmented, distracted, and infected with Wuhan. If the 2 billion Muslims on this planet suddenly realize that they hold the absolute, unadulterated source code of reality, the matrix would shatter overnight. If we collectively refuse to consume their riba-based financial products, their economy would instantly collapse. If we collectively refuse to consume their weaponized media, their psychological control grid would evaporate. If we collectively rejected their artificial borders and re-established the concept of the ummah as a single unified political and spiritual body, their geopolitical hegemony would be utterly erased. They project an aura of absolute omnipotence, but they are ruling over a house of cards. They are terrified of you. They spend billions of dollars every single year specifically to keep you distracted with mindless entertainment, toxic arguments, and secular ambitions, because they are desperately trying to delay the inevitable moment when the giant finally wakes up. To catalyze this awakening, we have to completely eradicate the sanitized, apologetic version of Islam that has infected the modern discourse. For decades, we have been told that the only way to survive in the West or in the modern secular world is to water down our religion. We were told to hide the concepts of jihad, to apologize for the Sharia, and to desperately prove to the 80 factions that we are just peaceful, compliant consumers who happen to pray 5 times a day. We tried to play their meta, and what did it achieve? It achieved absolute, catastrophic humiliation. It emboldened the overlords to slaughter us with impunity because they knew we had completely lost our spiritual spine. You do not negotiate with a system that is actively trying to erase your existence. The truth is not meant to peacefully coexist with falsehood. The truth is meant to utterly eradicate falsehood. جاء الحق وزهق الباطل جاء الحق وزهق الباطل كان زهوقا. You must start speaking with the absolute, uncompromising authority of a person who holds the final revelation of the Creator. You do not need to adapt the Quran to fit the sensibilities of the 21st century. The 21st century must be judged, broken, and realigned to fit the Quran. Stop apologizing for the source code. Stop trying to make the truth palatable to NPCs who despise you. Embody the unshakable frequency of the victorious party. As the eschatological timeline accelerates, you have to protect your ultimate objective, the preservation of your qalb. The system will throw everything it has at you to corrupt it. They will use the algorithms to feed you endless streams of despair, lust, and manufactured outrage. They will use the economy to crush you with anxiety. They will use the geopolitical theater to make you feel completely hopeless. But you must understand that the condition of your heart is the only metric that matters. On the day of judgment, يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. The day when neither wealth nor children will be of any benefit except for he who comes to Allah with a sound heart. The overlords can take your wealth, they can bomb your house, they can imprison your body. but they cannot force you to commit shirk. They cannot force you to stop remembering Allah. They cannot touch your qalb as-salim unless you voluntarily hand them the keys. The ultimate victory in this hardcore survival world is not surviving until you are 80 years old in a comfortable corporate job. The ultimate victory is crossing the finish line, battered, bruised, and completely exhausted by the trials of the dunya, but with a heart that is entirely pure and completely submitted to the dev. Do not let them corrupt your code. Do not let the simulation trick you into trading your eternal rank for a few days of temporary, miserable comfort. We have to realize that the chaos we are seeing right now is actually a profound mercy. The illusion of the peaceful, prosperous, secular world order was the most dangerous trap ever laid for the ummah. It put millions of believers to sleep. We became comfortable, we became complacent. We started loving the matrix. The sheer unprecedented brutality of the 1v80 coalition is the violent alarm clock that the ummah desperately needed. It is the shattering of the illusion. The mask is completely off. The global institutions have revealed themselves to be nothing more than the hypocritical enforcement arm of the Dajjal system. You can no longer pretend that the secular world has your best interests at heart. The gray area has been entirely eliminated. The sides have been clearly violently drawn. You are either with the 80 flags of the simulation or you are with the one flag of absolute reality. This clarity is a gift. It forces you to make a definitive choice. It forces you to actually examine your own yaqeen. Are you a Muslim just because it is your cultural background? Or are you a Muslim because you are genuinely prepared to hold the burning coal when the entire planet turns against you? The furnace is hot right now, but the fire is purifying. It is burning away the hypocrisy and leaving only the absolute truth. You must anchor your psychology to the inevitability of the divine promise. The secular mind looks at the current geopolitical board and sees a terrifying, unbeatable monopoly of power. But the believer looks at the exact same board and sees the final desperate flailing of an arrogant empire right before its divine collapse. Allah does not break His promises. The Prophet ﷺ promised us that this matter, this religion, will reach everywhere that the night and the day reach. He promised us that the system of deception will eventually be utterly destroyed by the return of Isa ibn Maryam. The ultimate victory of the believers is not a possibility. It is a mathematical, absolute certainty written into the core physics of the universe. The overlords are fighting a war that they have already mathematically lost. Their AI cannot save them. Their nuclear arsenals cannot save them. They are marching their entire civilization straight into the crushing reality of the divine decree. Your job is not to panic. Your job is not to save the entire world by yourself. Your job is simply to ensure that you are standing on the right side of the line, holding the source code when the simulation finally ends. So this is the final reality check. The user who wrote that comment saw past the noise, and now you have to do the same. The dunya hardcore survival world is reaching its final, most intense stages. The 1v80 is no longer a historical concept. It is the daily headline on your feed. The top-ranked overlords are terrified, and they are using every weapon in their arsenal to keep you distracted, divided, and paralyzed by fear. You have to make a choice today. You can continue to play the role of the NPC, consuming their media, grinding in their corporate matrix, and desperately seeking the validation of a system that hates you. You can stay asleep in the golden cage until the angel of death wakes you up. Or you can embrace the profound honor of the schizo awakening. You can unplug your mind from their psychological operations. You can rebuild your physical body, purify your income, and completely sever the love of the dunya from your heart. You can seek out the other strangers, rebuild the physical jama'ah, and align yourself entirely with the Taif and Mansura. The choice is binary. The simulation does not allow for a middle ground anymore. Do not just close this video and immediately scroll to the next piece of dopamine-inducing entertainment. Do not let this realization just be a fleeting moment of existential dread. Let this be the absolute end of your participation in the illusion. The architecture of the final deception is real. The trap is set, and the enemies are allied against the truth. But the Quran is the ultimate Easter egg from the dev, and it contains the exact instructions you need to exit the matrix. Stop fearing the overlords. Stop fearing the media. Fear the one who holds your soul in his absolute grip. The meta is broken. The illusion is shattering. The ultimate victory is getting into the paradise server, and the only way to get there is to hold the absolute truth in the face of the entire world. Wake up, unplug from the despair, stand firm on the path of the Guljarba. The victorious party is waiting for you to take your place on the board. The game is almost over. Prepare for reality.